Who was William Shakespeare? This is an introductory video to Shakespeare, his background based on historical fact with some assumption included. Students are to complete the notes handout and submit this for points. So some background on Shakespeare's early life and education. First, he was born in April 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon, England. All right, that means Stratford on the River Avon, England. His father was John Shakespeare, a glover, and his mother was Mary, and both parents were illiterate, which meant that they couldn't read or write. This is important because later on in education, you're going to see that Shakespeare is a bit different. Now, a couple things you're going to want to know about Shakespeare is that, first, there's no physical proof that Shakespeare actually had a formal education. Now, what this means is that historians are assuming he went to the King Edward VI grammar school in Stratford because that's what all boys between ages 7 and 14 did. And yes, only boys. Girls did not get any type of education. And the only reason they're doing this is because there's no proof that Shakespeare attended because floods wiped out the historical records for the school about 50 to 100 years after he died. So this is guesswork. Okay? Now, there's also, and this is really important, no proof he attended any university. And there's no physical proof. And because his parents couldn't read, it makes you wonder, how could he have gone? And the other thing is, as glovers, that's a respectable trade, but it's a trade. It's not an intellectual job like lawyers, politicians, and so forth. Shakespeare did have political office in Stratford, but it was very small. But he was not, there was no proof that he could sign his name. So this is really kind of subjective, kind of opinionated, and there's a lot of historians that have a lot of opinions of what this means. But that's a fact. There's no proof he attended any university because it cost money. And being a glover, that wasn't enough money to send your child to school. Before we move on, you need to know the role of the church. And as in most old communities or old societies, the church was very important. It was the center of the community, and a lot of education was based around that. And in the 1560s, England was finding itself transitioning from a Catholic religion as its state religion to being Protestant. And that had to do with Henry VIII and his 7 wives and his desire for divorce and seeking an heir to his throne. That's why we have Protestant religions now, because most Protestants believe in divorce, whereas Catholics don't. And back then, the religion of individual people, the subjects as they're called, was the ruler's choice. So if your ruler was Catholic, you had to be Catholic. If your ruler was Anglican or Protestant, you had to be that. And that's how it was in England. And Queen Elizabeth I becomes the first openly Protestant monarch. Some would argue that King Edward VI before her is, but he's replaced by his sister Bloody Mary, who is Catholic. But Queen Elizabeth starts the Protestant chain of English monarchs for Shakespeare to deal with. And this is important because if you were Catholic, she handled you pretty nicely compared to what some people wanted. The government fined you. Sometimes they put you in prison, but not likely. They could even burn you at the stake, which is what Catholics did to Protestants. And this is important because there were rumors that John Shakespeare was actually secretly a Catholic. He wasn't making it popular. He would go to the Anglican services, and then the rumor was that afterwards they would go to a holy site around Stratford and they'd have service. And this is important because, as you'll see, Shakespeare becomes very popular with Protestant rulers. So Shakespeare's adulthood starts off interestingly enough. In 1582, he marries Anne Hathaway, a local woman, and we would consider this a bit scandalous because, he becomes popular, but at the time, he was only 18 and she's 26, but she's 3 months pregnant. Again, we kind of go, whoa, that's a big deal, except that was pretty usual for a man and woman to get married when the woman was pregnant. And did they marry for love? We don't know. But had they not been married, there would have been a lot of consequences, bad consequences, especially for her, because it's against the law to get married or to have sex and children out of wedlock. So in 1583, 6 months after they're married, you have the birth of Susanna, their first daughter, and then in 1585 you have the birth of the twins, Hamnet and Judith. So from this point on, seems like Shakespeare is a nice family man, except that we don't have any records of him. And that's kind of weird. In fact, Shakespeare shows up right around 1590, 1592, depending on who you ask. And in 1590, that's when his first play, or the play that he is credited for, is performed. And I believe that is King Henry VII. Okay, so he is performed. But we don't know if it was really him. Right? And then in 1592, we get the first public recognition for Shakespeare, and it's not positive. He is called an upscale crow, which is not a compliment. It is a criticism. All right? He's loud and obnoxious, and he's trying to steal credit from legitimate writers, according to this individual, and we'll talk more about that later. And then what happens is that a few things from there. 1594, Shakespeare, who's found success in London, becomes a shareholder in what's called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. That's an acting company. And Lord Chamberlain's Men, that is a name taken after Lord Chamberlain. And what this does is he is the patron. He provides them money, but more importantly, he provides them with political cover. So if something happens, they mess up, they say the wrong thing, this Chamberlain will basically vouch for them. It's kind of like a teacher looking out for students. So if my TA did something silly, I could go to Mrs. Prescott and look out for them. That's kind of what this Chamberlain did for this acting company. But they become really popular. So popular, in fact, that they're performing for Queen Elizabeth up at Whitehall, which is her palace. And they're doing that quite frequently. In 1603, Shakespeare has been a decade of success now. He's well known. He's built the Globe. Okay, in fact, in 1599, the Globe is first published. Then in 1603, we have a new king. He takes over. King James I takes over after the death of Elizabeth, who ruled for roughly 50 years. Okay, that was the age of what's called Elizabethan England, or Elizabethan England, Tudor England, because that was her last name. Now, this King James loves theater, so he immediately becomes patron of this reformed King Chamberlain's men, and he calls them the King's Men. So he is their patron. So he now pays some bills, a little bit, gives them some money, but he really protects them. And that's really important because there's a rising group of people in political London, political England, called the Puritans. And they don't like theater. They think it's sinful, they think it's scandalous, and they want all theaters disbanded. But the king, he's the leader of the country, he decides. And that's really, really important. So at this point, mid-1600s, late 1600s, we start seeing Shakespeare wind down. A lot of his plays are still being published, roughly 3 a year, which is pretty remarkable. And depending on who you look at for historical fact, we see his sonnets are written. They are written, some people say 1597, some say around 1609, 1611. It's hard to tell because records weren't well kept, but we do know he wrote 154 of them. However, we do not know who he wrote them for, who they're to. So there's some guesswork in there as well. Okay. Now, Shakespeare does retire from working in 1611. So roughly 21 years of work. Pretty good. He returns to Stratford-upon-Avon, England, to his home. He has since had it enlarged. He's purchased a few properties. And because of his success, he was able to get his father a set of coat of arms in 1596. That is not an easy thing to come about. A coat of arms means basically you've made it. You are well known. The king or queen recognizes you. And Shakespeare's success does that basically for his dad. So in 1596, Shakespeare's father, John, gets a royal coat of arms. And that's because of his son. Now, Shakespeare does die in 1616 back in London, and his will, he leaves for his wife, his darling wife, their second best bed. And we'll talk about what that means. So let's take a look at Shakespeare's legacy. In his 21 years of work, give or take, he wrote roughly 37 plays. Some say 38, but that's debatable, and 154 sonnets. He is historically credited with creating between 1,700 and 2,000 new words by himself added to the English language, words which we use today. He is also popular because he came up with such phrases as vanishing into thin air, the game is up, send him packing, fair play, foul play, and all of a sudden. So, who is Shakespeare, or who was Shakespeare? That's a great question, because clearly we still do not know.